Hello, welcome to another episode of Tech Time Today. My name is Jeff Welpley, and in this episode, we're going to be going over a backend framework called AdonisJS. We're going to get my initial reaction to this framework that I just discovered recently, and I'll talk about a little bit of going over this article about the latest release of this backend framework and what it's all about, why you may want to try it out, what my reaction is to this compared to perhaps some other popular backend frameworks that are out there. If you haven't already, make sure that you subscribe to Tech Time Today, like this video if you enjoyed the content. And if you have any thoughts on AdonisJS or other backend frameworks, definitely leave comments below. All right, let's get started. All right, so we're going to be looking at an article by one of the contributors to AdonisJS, Harminder Verk, and just a recent article he created for the latest version. Just to kind of give background here, I had never heard of this framework before. I don't really go out looking for different backend frameworks, but I do keep an eye on the different JavaScript related news articles, news aggregation emails that kind of come out. And this was highlighted in one of them, and it seemed interesting to me because like Harminder mentions right off the top, is focused on basically being a modern backend framework as opposed to perhaps some older frameworks like Express, which are super stable and very, very good at what they do, but have a lot of legacy stuff and have really stagnated, over time. So it is an interesting angle just off the bat, and I do kind of like to look at these things. Just in general, by the way, sometimes, it's very rare that I start utilizing a brand new framework, but the thing I find really valuable, even if I don't jump in and use, a new framework, is that there's a lot of stuff you can learn from these, even if you don't use them, that you could bring into other frameworks, or even just the way that you write your own code. Let's go through a couple of these things. They focus on using, ESM instead of CJS, so the modern module way of importing modules. And that makes sense if you're kind of building stuff. That is the direction that they want the JavaScript community is going towards. So CJS is obviously there to support the many, many, many legacy libraries and everything that's out there. But the whole thing that Adonis is going for is, just focusing on the modern stuff. So it totally makes sense. One of the things that they mentioned actually here in terms of the way that they were doing imports and also some of the way they were doing routes before is some of the initial versions. I didn't use this framework initially, but the thing that he talks about in the article is how they previously tried to do a lot of magic behind the scenes, like to on the face of it, make things easier for the developer. But a lot of times, and I've found this to be the case with a lot of the stuff I've done, even the custom stuff I've done, or when I've contributed to other frameworks, is that when you make those kind of quote unquote magic abstractions, it inevitably causes problems. So like they were trying to do something special for on top of the TypeScript compiler. And then like for routes, for example, they were trying to you pass in this string and then it automatically generates a bunch of code based off of this string to kind of make things easier. But the thing is that it's not very obvious, and it just in a general sense when you use these non-standard ways of doing things. And I'm sure they've had a number of problems. Again, I don't know that for a fact, but I know myself, I've run into all sorts of issues when you try to create those types of abstractions. So it's nice to see something where they, maybe it's an extra line of code, but that's the thing is, okay, it's an extra line of code, but it makes things so much more straightforward. It sort of more standard, makes it easier to do refactoring, like having your ID to do refactoring and that type of thing. And as far as route, this type of feature you'll see in most backend frameworks. So it's probably a matter of what appeals to you versus not. And this framework does seem to have a pretty good following. So I would imagine that some of this is pretty appealing. So middleware is another common part of any backend JavaScript / TypeScript framework. So it looks like they, making this type safe, it looks great. I actually kind of one impression just looking at the different APIs is that a lot of them are really clean. Like it's you could tell that they've gone through a number of iterations to kind of boil it down to just what is needed. So this makes a lot of sense to me. So let's go a little bit further. So this is one thing that's interesting. Most frameworks have to have some sort of configuration / resource file to define how things work. So I do find it interesting that they moved from a previously JSON file, which packaged JSON. A lot of things model themselves after the way that Node does it at a package level with package JSON, and Angular has Angular JSON. That somewhat makes sense, but I actually really like it that they made it just a straight TypeScript file, because when your resource file is actual code, without even looking into the specifics here, I just know from experience that it just makes it much more flexible and easier to deal with. You can just as an example, one of the things that I deal with all the time is the differences between different environments. And there's ways to do that with package JSON and Angular JSON and a lot of these other JSON files of how to deal with environment specific stuff. But I just feel like when it's just code you're dealing with instead of a JSON file, it just usually gives you a lot more flexibility and is easier to use. Going down a little bit further, looks like they have Vite integration. I'm a big fan of Vite. And it looks like in these last few sections of the article, they go over some of the ancillary supporting libraries that they have. So typically with a framework, you have the sort of core, things like routing and how you structure the actual code. But then there's usually a lot of supporting libraries, do testing and validation, other things. So it looks like they've spent a good deal of time on some of those. But my initial reaction is that this is a really thorough, obviously mature. There's just been a lot of work put into this because it has both gone through a number of iterations to clean up a number of things to make the APIs clean, and having all the different supporting libraries that you would want. And this last section talks about, documentation and test. It's not necessarily sexy part of the framework, but when you have good documentation and good testing experience, that just makes your day-to-day experience of the developer, so much better. And that's where over time, the usage of a framework, where they grow to love it so much more. I know that the front-end framework that I most often use, Angular, they've put a lot of effort into documentation, for example, because they have realized this as well. So I'm a big supporter of different libraries and frameworks that understand this and have just really good documentation. All right, this will be the last thing that I talk about because I did find this interesting when I was reading through this article in terms of the way in which folders and files are named, that they are moving from Pascal case to snake case. I almost feel like sometimes you could have the best framework in every other sense, but they standardize on snake case, which you should standardize on something for sure. That's one thing that's super important, regardless of what your naming conventions are. It drives me crazy to see multiple different things. So they standardize on snake case, that's great, but I just know for a fact that some people will just not use a framework because they just don't like snake case. Everything else could be great, but they just don't like snake case, just an example. But it's just funny that it makes things tough as a framework author, because I don't think there's one right answer. And I'm not saying that in this case they did it wrong, because it's perfectly fine, but I just think it's an interesting thing. All right, and that's it for today, talking about AdonisJS. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and look forward to seeing you again next time on Tech Time Today.